Hi, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join me on this week's video. On this week's video, we're in session number 3 of our new series entitled Complex Medical Decision Making and the Qualified Medical Evaluator. And this is session number 3, and in today's session, we're going to complete the first part of this 3-part program. And the purpose of this program is to help you as a qualified medical evaluator make the difficult sections in your report easy. That's the whole purpose. Now, qualified medical evaluators seem to struggle greatly in 3 basic sections of the report. You see, qualified medical evaluators don't struggle in the review of records section of the report. They don't struggle in the social history. They don't struggle in the physical examination section of the report where they have to simply input the findings of range of motion and circumferential measurements, etc. Qualified medical evaluators find those sections of the report to be easy. It's the sections of the report where the qualified medical evaluator has to bear down and sustain concentration for an extended period of time and make reasoned and rational and substantial opinions wherein the QMEs find the greatest struggle. And that struggle has to do with lack of proper tools. Nobody gave you the tools to handle these sections of the report. The tools for resolving difficult issues are not taught to us in continuing education seminars. They're not taught to us in our initial training for our QME credential. And so qualified medical evaluators find themselves lacking the proper tools, which if they had would make the job of completing these sections of the report very, very simple. And let me just give you a simple example to help illustrate this principle. My wife gave me a task to sharpen all of our hedge trimmers and clippers and cutting devices for doing our landscaping work, because at this time of the year it's important to cut back all of the plants and the flowers and the roses and etc. and all the bushes, etc. So my wife gave me the job of taking about 6 pair of cutting shears and instruments down to the shop and sharpening them up and tuning them up for the work ahead. And I put this job off and I put this job off, and she asked me, "Did you sharpen the shears?" And I said, "I'm going to sharpen the shears." And I put it off and I did all my other tasks for days and weeks while the shears sat on my workbench down at the shop. Well, when her pestering started to become more urgent, I realized that I must confront the shears. So I went down to my shop. I took out an abrasive scrub pad. I took out a piece of steel wool, and I began the process of laboriously using elbow grease, cleaning off the shears and taking out my file and filing the edges of these shears to restore them to functional duty for the spring cleanup. Well, as I was on my second pair of shears, my neighbor came over and he asked me what I was doing. I told him what I was doing, and he said, "Stop right where you are. Stop. Don't do anything. I'll be right back." And he went next door over to his house, and he came back with this circular wire brush, circular wire tool. And the tool plugged into the end of a drill, so that when you turn the drill on, it spun this wire circular brush. And what he did was he sprayed a little bit of WD-40 around the perimeter of this wire brush, and then using the drill gun, he took this wire brush to the surface of these cutting shears and hedge trimmers, and in one fell swoop, in about 30 seconds, those shears were brand new, shiny down to the chrome, not a bit of gum from any of the plants, and the edges were just as razor sharp as you can imagine. So all in one fell swoop in about 30 seconds, with the proper tool, he did what would have taken me probably about an hour using elbow grease and not know-howingness to actually do the job properly. So that's an illustration to illustrate that when you have the correct tools, the project diminishes. It becomes not so overwhelming. And in this program, we're talking about how to make these sections of your report, the AOECOE determination, the permanent impairment determination, and the apportionment approximate percentages, not overwhelming at all, by giving you the proper tools with which to analyze the facts of your case so that you can quickly and accurately arrive at the correct determination in every single case. Now, in our last session, we talk about, let me back up. So let me say, in today's session, we're in session number 3 of the first section of this report. In the first section of this report, we're talking about how to make the difficult determination on AOECOE. And specifically, we're talking about the unique and difficult scenario that involves the post-employment cumulative trauma claim that has been denied by the claims administrator. Okay, so this is a very difficult determination on AOECOE. And in our last session, we talked about why it is that so many of these claims come to us as denied claims. In other words, they're not accepted claims. Accepted claims don't need a determination on AOECOE. It's only the denied claims for which we're called in to provide a compensability determination. And so we talked about why it is that so many of these claims come to us as denied claims. And that has to do with the claims administrator's knowledge of a couple of things. The claims administrator acknowledges that in these cases, the injured worker, the claimant, the employee, the person seeking workers' compensation benefits, has no way to establish proof of an industrial injury. And the claims administrator knows that the law, in fact, there's actually 3 laws, the law places the burden for establishing industrial injury on the person claiming industrial injury. The person forwarding the affirmative of the issue, which is the employee, has the burden of establishing the proof of the injury. And in these cases, the claims administrator looks at the facts of the case and realizes that this employee has no way to be able to prove industrial injury, and the claims administrator brings out the denied stamp to deny the claim for industrial injury. And then the second thing is that causes claims administrators to deny these cases has to do with the problem of rampant fraud in workers' compensation. And statistics are well known and studies are well known and have long been published about fraud in workers' compensation claims, specifically fraud related to the post-employment claim for cumulative trauma injury. And so in a knee-jerk reaction, when this particular type of claim comes into the claims administrator reflexively just denies the case. And then the case comes to us for the compensability determination. Well, in today's session, I want to talk to you about how it is that you can quickly and accurately arrive at the correct determination on AOECOE every single time. I want to give you the tools, like my neighbor gave me that wire brush, that grinding wire brush. I want to give you the tools upon which you can rely when it comes time for you to sit down, to concentrate, to review the facts of the case and come up with the AOECOE determination that's so critical that it be correct. It's absolutely critical that your determination be correct in every single case. It is probably the most critical determination that we as qualified medical evaluators are called upon to render, which is the AOECOE determination in a case that has been denied, in a claim that has been denied. So today we're going to talk about the causation algorithm, and we're going to clear up a couple of uncertainties related to the differences between AOE and COE. And we're going to talk about how to establish, number one, the evidence of an injury. First of all, for a claim for industrial injury to be forwarded and for it to succeed, there has to be evidence of an injury. If there's no injury, then of course there's no claim for industrial injury. So an injury is central to the claim, either moving forward or being stopped dead in its tracks as a denied claim. So we're going to talk about how to establish evidence of an injury. And then in the presence of a bona fide injury, if the examinee has evidence of an injury, we're going to talk about how to establish the examinee's credibility and how to ascertain the veracity of the examinee's statements to you as to the presence or the absence of an industrial injury. And these two components, first of all, establishing the injury and then determining the examinee's credibility, these are going to contribute, these are going to be the tools upon which we're going to base our AOE-COE determination. And if we can do a good job in both of these key areas, we can relax and be comfortable in knowing that we provided the proper determination on these denied cases in every single case. So with that as our introduction, let's begin today's discussion, which is entitled The Causation Algorithm, as we continue in our new series entitled Complex Medical Decision Making and the QME. Okay, so we're talking about how to make the difficult determination of AOE-COE in the denied post-employment cumulative trauma claim. Now, this is a very, very difficult determination. So as step one in learning how to resolve these cases accurately, let's review what is it? What is the role of the qualified medical evaluator in these cases? And let's just review AOE and COE. Now, as we know, AOE stands for arising out of employment, and COE stands for occurring in the course of employment. So if we think about it, COE, course of employment, is an actual factual determination. Did an industrial injury factually actually occur as a result of the workplace duties? Now recall that these are cases coming to us post-employment. So this is a situation where the examinee or the employee has long separated the relationship with the employer. How can the qualified medical evaluator actually determine as an actual factual determination whether an industrial injury occurred or not? The qualified medical evaluator cannot and does not make the COE determination. The COE determination is made by the trier of fact, which is the judge, and the role of the qualified medical evaluator, therefore, is to focus on AOE, arising out of employment issues. So let's explore this a little bit more. Recall that these post-employment cumulative trauma claims are disallowed by law. They're disallowed under Labor Code 3600, and sometimes you'll see in the cover letters that you receive, especially from defense attorneys or from the claims administrator, they will tell you that the claim has been denied based upon the post-termination defense. The claims administrator is defending the claim by raising the post-employment argument under Labor Code 3600. So let's read from Labor Code 3600. It tells us that except for psychiatric injuries, except for those, okay, for all other injuries that we typically deal with, the neuromusculoskeletal, physical body, internal medicine type of injuries, when the claim for compensation is filed after notice of termination or layoff, okay, so the injured worker files a claim for industrial injury long after they've separated from the employer, regardless of the type of separation, whether it was a termination, a layoff, a COVID-19 furlough, a retirement, a sabbatical, whatever. The claim is filed after the relationship with the employer has been terminated. Tells us no compensation shall be paid. This is the law. So these types of claims are frustrated by law. The law denies these particular types of claims, except when a few particular situations or scenarios can be demonstrated. So The law 3600 generally denies or prohibits these types of claims, but of course there are a couple of exceptions to Labor Code 3600 that could allow these types of claims to move forward. And as relates to cumulative trauma claims, the exception is found in Labor Code 3610D, which tells us that when the date of injury, when the date of a cumulative trauma injury is subsequent to the date of termination or the layoff, then this claim can fly. And remember, the date of a cumulative trauma injury is defined in Labor Code 5412. 5412. It's 5411 that defines the date of injury for a specific injury claim. But 5412 tells us what qualifies as the date of injury for a cumulative trauma claim. And for a cumulative trauma claim, the date of injury can be days, weeks, months, years after the separation from the employer. And this makes sense, especially in those cases of occupational illnesses. So for example, imagine a coal miner working in a coal mine their entire life, and at the age, the proper retirement age, the coal miner retires from mining coal and 2 to 3 years later develops a cough. And the coal miner, or the retired coal miner, goes to his doctor for investigation of the cough, and the doctor takes a history from the coal miner, and the doctor makes a connection with the coal miner's current symptoms of a cough to the prior workplace activities of working in a coal mine. And so in this type of a scenario with these occupational illnesses, the coal miner didn't learn of an industrial injury until long after the employment relationship had been terminated. So the date of injury for this particular industrial injury in the coal miner is the date upon which one of two things happened. Is the date upon which the coal miner first suffered disability, it's number one, or number two, first required medical treatment. Now in this case, the coal miner never did suffer disability. He retired with no disability, no work restrictions, no need for total temporary disability, no need for total partial disability or total temporary disability, had no disability. But the date that he first required medical treatment, which came about 2 to 3 years after his last day of work with the company, with the coal mine, that becomes the date of injury. And that's the date of injury referred to here in 3610D, which tells us that in this case, when the date of injury is after the date of notice of termination or layoff. And this is the exception that allows these claims to fly. And this explains why so many post-employment cumulative trauma claims are being filed, because employees are claiming that they first discovered the injury after the separation from the employer. And it's this particular loophole in the law that allows for a date of injury to be after the last date of employment. It's this particular exception that allows these claims to thrive and survive in huge, huge numbers. And this explains why we're getting so many of these for our determination. So what's the role of the QME? The role of the QME is not to focus on COE. COE is determined by the trier of fact. The purpose of the role of the QME is to provide an opinion on AOE. AOE. And AOE stands for arising out of employment. So the role of the qualified medical evaluator is to provide an opinion as to whether or not it's reasonably medically probable that the symptoms and the condition that the employee presents to you on the date of your evaluation, that it's reasonably medically probable that those symptoms or that condition could have been contributed to by the workplace duties as described by the employee. Now let me repeat that because this is critical for your AOE-COE determination. The role of the qualified medical evaluator is to answer the following question, and this particularly applies to the post-employment cumulative trauma type of claim. The question that you're being called upon to answer is it reasonably medically probable, in other words, is there a 51% or greater likelihood that the symptoms that the examinee reports to you or that the condition that the examinee presents to you could have been contributed to a significant degree by the workplace duties in the way that the examinee described them to you. And that's the question that you're being called upon to resolve. Okay? So let's explore some of these AOE issues that you're going to rely upon, that they're going to be the tools that you're going to rely upon in formulating your opinion either for or against industrial injury. Okay, so our causation algorithm is going to consist of two basic steps of medical decision making that we need to employ as the tools in helping us arrive at our AOE and COE determination. Number one is the establishment of an injury condition. Without an injury condition, there can be no claim for an industrial injury. So in step one, we have to establish the presence or absence of an injury. And then number two, once we have the presence or absence of an injury established, in the case of a bona fide injury condition, we then need to assess the examinee's credibility in arriving at our AOE determination. Remember that the AOE determination is simply answering the following question. Is it reasonably medically probable that the condition or the symptoms that the examinee presents to you with could have been contributed to a significant degree by the workplace activities as described by the examinee? And this is where the examinee's credibility comes into place. So to begin, your first job is to establish the presence of an injury, and this is where your history taking and physical examination come into place. In the absence of an injury condition, with no injury, there can be no claim for an industrial injury. Now, examinees may present to you with symptoms, they may present to you with certain physical examination findings, but those symptoms and physical examination findings will only rise to the level of injury if those symptoms and if those findings require medical treatment. In the absence of a need for medical treatment, those symptoms and findings do not qualify as an injury. And we all have symptoms, and we all have physical examination findings. But not all of our symptoms and not all of our physical examination findings can be reasonably expected to improve with medical treatment of any kind. In other words, some of our symptoms are simply the effects of overuse or aging processes or degenerative processes that will not respond to any amount of medical treatment. And many examinees will present to us with symptoms and complaints of physical limitations, but that doesn't mean that those limitations and symptoms are going to respond to medical treatment. So an injury is very specific and as defined in the workers' compensation system. So if you don't find an injury condition, then the opinion for AOE-COE basically drops off and you can opine against an industrial injury. Now, when you find bona fide conditions in the examinee that you expect could reasonably respond to medical treatment, then those symptoms and conditions can qualify as an injury. And we will see examinees who present to us with conditions that do qualify as an injury. So let's assume that that's our scenario moving forward here in our algorithm. When we evidence a bona fide medical condition that qualifies as an industrial injury, then it becomes incumbent upon us to provide an opinion for industrial injury by focusing on the AOE issues. So what are some of the AOE issues that are going to be the tools upon which you're going to fashion your AOE argument? Well, Number one, the nature of the former job duties. Do the former job duties, the way the examinee described them to you, are those job duties the type of job duties that could reasonably result in the symptoms or in the physical conditions that you're discovering in your physical examination? If they are, then you're one step closer to a thumbs up determination on AOECOE. Number two, are there any outside contributors that could be the source of this examinee's symptoms and conditions? Does the examinee have any hobbies that could be causing the symptoms and conditions that the examinee is presenting to you? Does the examinee play sports? Does the examinee play soccer? Does the examinee have any outside habits, I'm sorry, not habits, but hobbies that could be the source of the same symptoms and physical examination findings that the examinee is attributing to or imputing to the workplace duties? In other words, we're going to be seeing examinees that have physical exam findings and that have symptoms. So once that's established, our job is to determine compensability. In other words, are those symptoms and are those physical exam findings reasonably due to the workplace duties, or are there outside contributors that are responsible for those symptoms and findings? Another AOE consideration is, has the employee or examinee had any subsequent injuries after their separation from the employer? What about the concept of reversibility? The concept of reversibility. I wonder if you're familiar with the concept of reversibility. This comes out of the AOECOE guidelines. And the AOECOE guidelines describe the concept of reversibility in connection with cumulative trauma type of symptoms. And recall, in this section of our program, we're talking about cumulative trauma injuries that are filed post-employment. Now, typically with cumulative trauma type injuries, we expect those injuries and the symptoms associated with those injuries to reverse themselves, to get better, to resolve, to lessen when the exposure to the injurious activity is eliminated. Now, in these post-employment cumulative trauma claims, these examinees are post-employment. They've long been away and long been removed from the injurious activities that they purport to have been the cause of their symptoms. Okay? And you can probably see where this is going. So with time away from the injurious activity, we would expect to see some reversal, some reversibility of the symptoms and of the physical examination findings. So especially in examinees who've received medical care, we would expect some reversibility. Examinees who have had adequate accommodations, such as work restrictions, such as total partial disability or total temporary disability. And in these cases, these examinees can be considered to be the equivalent of totally temporarily disabled because they're no longer with the employer, unless they've taken up a second job or have some subsequent employment. And I recently had two cases where that involved post-employment claims for cumulative trauma injury, wherein the employee was now on to a second job after separation from the original employer. One examinee went on to open up his own self-employed handyman company, where he did everything from installing drywall to plumbing work to electrical work to landscaping work, and his work was exceedingly more vigorous than his work with the employer against whom he was claiming industrial injury. And that, in that particular case, that explained the lack of reversibility of his symptoms, because he was engaging in physical activities even more vigorous than what were associated with the original employer. Okay, and then what about subsequent employment? That applies to the case I just referred to. I also had a recent case where an employee was working in food service industry separated from the employer, simultaneously took up another job, again in the food service industry, and had been in the second job for approximately a year when he went back and filed a claim against the first employer for cumulative trauma injury, wherein the job place duties at the second employer were roughly the same, similar, as he was exposed to in the original employment situation. And so that explained the lack of reversibility of his symptoms, because generally when removed from the injurious exposure, we expect some improvement in symptoms. And this is typical in the industrial setting, where an examinee will tell you that all week long as they work, they experience increasing symptoms, and then when they go home for the weekend and they have a chance to rest over Saturday and Sunday, that by the time they return to work on Monday morning, their symptoms are somewhat better, and then the whole cycle repeats over again, and we're seeing some reversibility of the symptoms over the weekend when they're removed from the injurious exposure. Or in a similar vein, employees or examinees will tell you that they recently went on a 2-week vacation, and while they were on vacation they felt great, and yet when they went back to work after the vacation, the whole symptom complex began up again. And this is another evidence of the reversibility concept, where the symptoms reversed when the employee was away on vacation and removed from the injurious exposure. So we expect some reversibility, and in these post-employment cumulative trauma claims, if the employee is no longer working, we would expect to see some reversibility of their symptoms. If there is no reversibility of the symptoms, then obviously there are other contributors keeping that symptom complex alive that needs to be factored in to the AOE and COE determination. Okay, so when we have an examinee who has a bona fide medical condition that you determine rises to the level of injury, as injury is defined in the California Workers' Compensation System, how can we assess the examinee's credibility as we listen to the examinee explain to us and answer our questions regarding the AOE issues in the case? So when you're sitting face to face with the examinee and you're discussing how the injury occurred and how that injury is related to the former job place duties, and when you're investigating whether or not there are any outside contributors that could be causing the same symptoms that the examinee is reporting to you, and when you're investigating the concept of reversibility, and when you're investigating whether or not the examinee suffered any subsequent injuries that could also explain their symptoms and their current physical exam findings, how can you assess the examinee's credibility? Because it's the examinee's credibility that's going to tip the scales for you, either for or against industrial injury, in those cases where you find examinees who have bona fide medical conditions that rise to the level of injury. And this is going to be common for you. You're going to find examinees that have medical conditions. That's why they're coming to you. They have medical conditions. They have positive physical exam findings. They have what would otherwise qualify as an injury in the workers' compensation system. But remember that the AOE-COE determination in these cases does not revolve around whether or not there's a condition, whether or not there's symptoms, whether or not there's pathology. So don't be confused by pathology. The opinion that you're being asked to render in this case, these 40-60 post-employment cumulative trauma claims that are denied, is whether or not the claim should be compensable. In other words, is it reasonably medically probable that the injury condition that you found has been contributed to a significant degree by the workplace duties that the examinee described to you? So how can you assess your examinee's credibility to help you arrive at the proper determination in these cases? Well, I I want to share with you some information and some tools that you can use in your face-to-face evaluation with the examinee to help discriminate between those examinees that are truth tellers that qualify for an industrial injury and those examinees who may not be as candid or as forthright with you as you would otherwise hope. So I want to share with you some techniques to help you arrive at a discrimination between the truth tellers and liars in the face-to-face evaluation. And I want to share with you two studies that apply exactly to the type of work that we do in accomplishing this exact determination. Number one is a study entitled Exploiting Liars' Verbal Strategies by Examining the Verifiability of Details. And then along the same lines, a second companion study where the concept of the verifiability of details is now being applied to insurance claims settings. So this study is entitled Applying the Verifiability Approach to Insurance Claims Settings. And isn't that what we're involved in? We're involved in insurance claims settings. These are settings wherein ex-employees are filing claims for cumulative trauma injury after their separation from the employer. This is an insurance claim setting. So this approach, this verifiability approach, is now being applied to insurance claim settings similar to the type of work that we do. And we can implement this strategy in our face-to-face interviewing techniques with the examinee to help us discriminate between those examinees who may be telling us the truth from those examinees who may be telling us not the whole truth. Okay? And the second study is going to expand upon the verifiability of details by employing what's referred to as the information protocol. And I'll share with you some of those ideas as we get into that study. Now, the purpose of this exercise that I'm going to share with you in the next several slides is to help you filter through the examinee's testimony, because many times all the examinees bring to the claims table is their testimony. Remember that the law requires that the burden of proof be placed upon the employee to prove industrial injury. But many times employees, all they have in an effort to prove their injury is their testimony. So we have to sift through their testimony to assess the examinee's credibility. And the verifiability approach is a very practical strategy that exactly applies to the type of work that we do. So let's explore this a little bit. Okay, so let's begin by reviewing the first study, Exploiting Liars' Verbal Strategies by Examining the Verifiability of Details. And the philosophy of this particular study is that liars speak differently than truth tellers. Liars have a verbal strategy. And that strategy and understanding that they have a strategy and understanding that liars speak differently from truth tellers gives us a clue and gives us a pathway for distinguishing between truth tellers and liars. And this particular study teaches us how to exploit the differences in the communication styles between liars and truth tellers to open up an obvious gap, to make the gap and the difference between truth tellers and liars much more pronounced so that we can clearly identify those examinees who may not be telling us the whole truth. Okay? So they tell us in this study that distinguishing truth from lies is a difficult task. Reviews of more than 100 deception experiments have shown that nonverbal and verbal cues to deceit are typically faint and unreliable. They're faint and unreliable. So the nonverbals are faint and unreliable, and the verbal cues are faint and unreliable, and that makes it difficult to separate truth from lies. In addition, reviews of more than 150 lie detection experiments have revealed that observers who listen to the verbal speech, to someone's speech, so observers who pay attention to the verbal component of the communication, or observers who observe someone's nonverbal behaviors, okay, so here's the verbal and the nonverbal, classify on average only 54% of truth tellers and liars correctly, which is just 4% over chance, 50-50, which would be achieved by just tossing a coin. So distinguishing truth from lies is very difficult because the cues that we think we rely upon, the cues that we think separate truth tellers from liars, are actually not that reliable. So just by listening to someone talk or just by watching someone's behavior leads us to believe whether the person is telling the truth or not. But these cues through research show are slightly only better than chance at distinguishing between truth tellers and liars. Now they go on to tell us in this study that one explanation as to why cues to deceit are faint and unreliable is that liars cannot take their credibility for granted. Okay, and that makes them different from truth tellers. Truth tellers take their credibility for granted, and they simply tell their story as if they expect to be believed. Okay, truth is the default setting in human communication. But liars don't have the comfort of truth on their side, and so they can't therefore simply let the truth speak for itself, and they cannot take their credibility for granted. So therefore, they have to make efforts to attempt to make an honest impression, whereas a truth teller doesn't have to make any attempt at all. So the communication strategies of liars and truth tellers differ in this important respect, that truth tellers don't have to make any attempt to make an honest impression because they rely on their credibility, they rely on their truthfulness as their credibility. So liars control their speech and behavior, and so that's control their behavior, this is the nonverbals, and they control their speech, which is the verbals, and attempt to display behaviors and say things that they believe give an honest impression, and on the other hand, they avoid behaviors and speech that they believe raise suspicion. And when they succeed in their attempts, which they often do, it blurs the nonverbal and verbal differences between liars and truth tellers, and consequently decreases the ability to distinguish between them. And when I talk to qualified medical evaluators about their examinee, many times qualified medical evaluators will tell me, well, I believed him or her. I believed him or her. And then they'll go on and they'll say, listen, I know when someone's lying to me. Okay? And we just determined that cues to deception are faint and unreliable and are accurate in only about 50% of cases. So qualified medical evaluators tell me that I know when someone's lying to me and telling me stories, and I believe this particular person. And indeed, these studies tell us that it's very difficult to distinguish between truth tellers and liars because of the blurring and the similarity between the nonverbal and verbal communications between liars and truth tellers. Very, very difficult to distinguish between the two. However, and this is where the verifiability of details approach comes in, the awareness of liars' motivation to control their behavior and their speech, we're going to focus in this section of our discussion on speech, may uncover the differences between liars and truth tellers and could benefit lie detection. Now, this is important for us as qualified medical evaluators that need to provide an AOE determination, either for or against industrial injury, We want to assess the examinee's credibility and opine in favor of those examinees who qualify for an industrial injury, and opine against industrial injury in those examinees who don't provide sincere and honest testimony regarding their workplace duties. Now, according to one particular method that's used to assess interviewees or examinees, in this case statements, the interpersonal reality monitoring approach, listeners such as us in the qualified medical evaluation use content qualities to distinguish between truths and lies. And indeed, one of the verbal criteria observers say they rely most upon when detecting lies is richness in details. Richness in details. The richer an account is perceived to be in detail, the more likely it is to be believed. And we're going to assess our examinee's testimony regarding industrial injury for its richness in details. Have you ever had an examinee who had no details, was unable to provide details, whose details were scant, whose details were weak, whose details were vague, right? We refer to these examinees as vague historians, historians who do not have much in the way of detail to support their claim for an industrial injury. The richer an account is perceived to be in detail, the more likely it is to be believed. And perhaps this is why many qualified medical evaluators will tell me, I believed him or I believed her, is because the examinee provided copious details. They provided a testimony that was rich in detail. And now this is where the verifiability of details approach becomes important for us as qualified medical evaluators. So they go on to tell us that liars may be aware that people will analyze their accounts in terms of richness in detail, and therefore will try to provide additional details to make an honest impression. Okay, so you ask your teenage daughter where she was at 1 a.m. last night, and you're listening to her account as to her whereabouts for richness of detail. Now, she may provide you an account that's rich in detail, but that's only one step towards being believed. The next step has to do with how do we assess those details and how do we assess her statements of where she was last night to determine whether it's true or whether it's not true. So the investigators give us that insight here. They tell us that although providing details helps to generate an honest impression, it also puts liars at risk because investigators, such as us, may be able to verify some of these details and often do so. Liars are known to be aware of this danger and thus may be inclined to avoid mentioning details. So this puts liars in a dilemma. On the one hand, they are motivated to include many details so that they make an honest impression, and on the other hand, they are motivated to avoid providing details to minimize the chances of being caught. Now, a truth teller does not have such a dilemma. A truth teller is not at peril or at risk of being caught. A truth teller simply provides an account rich in details without worrying about whether the details are verifiable or not. Whereas liars are worried that they may mention details that could be verified and found to be false, in which cases they would be caught and be identified as not truth tellers. So liars are in a dilemma. They're stuck between a rock and a hard place. They want to provide details so that their account sounds convincing, but they want to withhold details that could be potentially verified. So a strategy that compromises between these two conflicting motivations is to provide details, but to provide details that cannot be verified? Examinee says, I put a note on my supervisor's desk. Is that a detail that can be verified? The examinee says, I rolled my ankle in the warehouse between 3 and 4 p.m. Is that a detail that can or cannot be verified? So, for example, it's much more difficult for the police to verify whether someone actually saw a black Audi driving by in a particular street than it is to verify whether someone actually made a phone call at a specific time. See, a phone call at a specific time is a detail that can be verified, whereas I saw a black Audi driving by Main Street at 2 a.m. is not a detail that can be verified. And liars are inclined to provide the type of details that cannot be verified, whereas truth tellers provide details that have a greater potential to be verified. So when attempting to make an honest impression, liars may choose to provide details that are difficult to verify and may avoid providing details that are easy to verify. If this is true, then lies can be detected by distinguishing between details that are difficult and details that are easy to verify. And so when you're sitting face to face with your examinee and they're discussing all the AOE issues involving their claim for industrial injury, you're going to be focusing on the details that they provide to you. First of all, if the testimony is rich with details, it's going to be more believable than a testimony that's devoid of details. For those testimonies that are rich in details, you want to separate those details out into the details that can be verified and the details that cannot be verified. And you'll find that the liars provide testimony full of details, none of which can be verified. Now, the way that this verifiability approach is put on steroids and the way that it can be adapted to the insurance claim settings and the type of work that we do is by incorporating what's referred to as the information protocol. And this was described in this particular study entitled Applying the Verifiability Approach to Insurance Claim Settings, exploring the effect of the information protocol. And what the information protocol refers to is you're informing, that's where information comes from, you're informing the examinee that you want the examinee to provide as many details about their industrial injury as they can possibly remember, and letting them know that you're going to be attempting to verify as many of these details as possible. In other words, you put them on notice that you want copious details and that you're going to track down these details. Now, this affects truth tellers and liars differentially. It's like when you tell a truth teller, hey, listen, I want you to give me as many details as you can, and I want you to know that I'm going to investigate these details. Well, truth tellers will pour on the details. They'll flood you with details. It's almost like you've issued a truth teller a challenge like, I'm going to check on these details, and they respond by saying, oh yeah, you check on them, and here I'm going to give you a load of details. If it's details you want, I'm going to give you a load of details. Whereas liars falter because they don't have details that can be verified because their testimony is not based upon truthful events. So in this particular study, the authors suggested that the information protocol moderates the effectiveness of lie detection by eliciting more verifiable details from truth tellers than liars. Now, without informing the claimants in advance, without telling them that, hey, I'm going to be checking on these details, without informing claimants about the interviewer's intention to analyze the statements for checkable details, truth tellers may disclose little verifiable details. If so, liars and truth tellers would differ little in terms of the verifiability of their statements. However, if truth tellers are informed, in other words, they're given the information protocol, if they're informed that reporting checkable detail is important, they are encouraged to report such verifiable information. However, even if the liars are also told the same thing, it remains problematic for them to be forthcoming with large quantities of such detail, because checkable detail can potentially threaten their credibility. And this is how you open up a gap, an obvious differential between liars and truth tellers by manipulating their communication strategy. The communication strategy is that liars withhold checkable detail that can be verified. And you open up a gap between truth tellers and liars, between credible and incredible examinees, by telling them in advance that you want them to provide as many details as possible and that you're going to be checking into the authenticity or the veracity of those details. So what you could say to your examinee is you could say, Mrs. Jones, I want you to describe in as much detail as possible how you developed the symptoms that you ascribed to your cumulative trauma injury with ABC employer. So please tell me as many details as you possibly can. And I want you to know that I'm going to be checking the medical records, and I'm going to be checking all the documents that have been sent to me, and I'm going to be checking on the details that you provide to me. So I want you to be as accurate as possible with those details, okay? And that's your information protocol. You inform the examinee in advance that you want as many details as possible and that you're going to be checking on those details. Now, truth tellers will be inclined to mention copious details, many of which can be verified. And you will notice this. You will notice this in the testimony of your examinee. A truth teller sort of takes this as a challenge, and they will flood you with details, and you'll be impressed with the details. Number one, you'll be impressed with the details, and number two, you'll be recording the details mentally in a Rolodex in your mind, and you'll be assessing those details for whether or not those details could potentially be verified. It's not that you're going to go out and verify the details. You're not going to go out and verify the details. It's whether or not the details have the potential to be verified. If they are details that could be verified if you had the time, the effort, the energy, the resources. Is it a detail that has the capacity to be verified or not? Okay. I saw a black Audi driving by Main Street at 3 a.m. as a detail that cannot in any way ever be verified. It has no potential for verification. But I put a post-it note on my boss's desk at 3 a.m. and I kept a copy of it right here. And here's my copy of it. Is a little bit closer to a detail that's potentially verifiable. It's at least a little bit closer, and that might not be the very best example. But you're looking for details that have the potential to be verified. And I'll give you some examples in just a minute. Liars, on the other hand, are inclined to mention sufficient details to provide a convincing account because they know richness in detail is what contributes to believability. But they try to avoid mentioning those details that could potentially be verified by the interviewer. So they'll withhold names, they'll withhold dates, they'll withhold details that could potentially be verified. Okay? So liars provide many non-verifiable details or details that would be difficult to verify. So there you have it. You have an examinee in front of you. You've advised the examinee to give you as many details as they possibly can, and you're listening to their testimony as they describe their AOE issues, as you interview them regarding the AOE issues, and you're simply listening to the examinee's testimony for the verifiability of the details that they offer to you. And in this way, you can assess the examinee's credibility to help you arrive at your AOE and COE determination. Okay, so now let's put this together into our causation algorithm that we can rely upon as our tools to arrive at an accurate AOE-COE determination, especially in these difficult cases that involve the post-employment cumulative trauma claim for industrial injury. So here it is, very simple, very useful tools, just like my neighbor bringing over that simple, useful tool of the circular wire brush that he used to clean my hedge trimmers. You know, when you have the right tools and you know how to use the tools, these jobs, especially these jobs that we face as qualified medical evaluators, become very, very simple. And the AOE-COE determination, very simply, boils down to whether or not the examinee has a bona fide medical condition. First of all, examinees are going to come to you with bona fide medical conditions, especially if they're in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. They're going to have pathology. They're going to have positive physical examination findings. Do not be sidetracked and diverted by bona fide medical conditions. They're going to have medical conditions. But the issue in these cases, these compensability evaluations, have to do with compensability. In other words, is the employer responsible for the payment of benefits for this particular condition? So it begins, it doesn't end, but it begins with a determination as to whether or not you identify a bona fide medical condition. If so, does that medical condition rise to the level of an injury as injury is defined in the California workers' compensation system? If it doesn't rise to the level of an injury, then you can provide an opinion against industrial causation. No industrial injury, no industrial cumulative trauma injury, if the examinee's condition does not rise to the level of an industrial injury. But let's say the condition does rise to the level of injury. In other words, you feel that the examinee's condition is reasonably expected to respond to medical treatment. The next determination is, after that, after you've determined a bona fide medical condition, next, is there medical evidence of AOE arising out of employment? Do the job place duties seem to be the type of duties that could contribute to the symptoms that the examinee is describing to you? Are there no outside activities that are also contributing? Is the examinee showing evidence of reversibility? Has the examinee suffered any subsequent injuries or other findings that would detract from your opinion for industrial injury? Or does all the evidence, all the medical evidence point towards an opinion for industrial injury? And this is where the credibility of the examinee comes into play. And I want to share with you just a brief story about an examinee that I recently had for whom I provided an opinion. I provided an opinion for industrial injury. So just last week I had an examinee who filed a claim. This was a claim for a specific incident of industrial injury. It wasn't a cumulative trauma injury, but it was a specific incident of injury. And some of these principles also apply to that case, so I'll share it with you. And the examinee filed the claim post-employment. In other words, he was terminated, and then he filed the claim for industrial injury. Well, these claims are barred by law, but certain exceptions exist. And the examinee came to me and he told me his story about how he suffered an injury, how he reported it, how he tried to obtain medical care, how he tried to contact the employers, how they refused to offer him work. And he told me a story similar to the stories that we hear from many examinees. And I listened to his story realizing that he had no way to be able to prove his injury, and that was the reason that his claim was denied. Well, as he continued to tell his story, he came forth with what seemed to be many details, and this separated him from the typical examinee who bring nothing to the evaluation and bring nothing in their testimony that's compelling or convincing or even remotely verifiable. This particular examinee brought forth many details that could potentially be verified. I'll give you an example. This guy was working in construction, working in housing, and he said that on the date of the injury, his employer, he stated he reported the injury to his employer, and the employer told him to go get medical care, and the employer referred him to a specific clinic, a Med 7 clinic. And because they were working on a construction site where there's no paper or notebooks or other writing instruments, the examinee or the employee wrote down the address of the Med 7 on a piece of baseboard base, on a piece of wood that they were using at the job site. And he brought this piece of baseboard to the evaluation with me. And he showed me this baseboard with the address of Med 7 written on the baseboard. So I thought, that was credible. That was credible. That he brought something from the job site. And it's something that could potentially be verified. In other words, I could take that address and I could match it up with the address of a local Med 7. It's potentially verifiable. Not completely verifiable and doesn't really contribute to the whole story, but it's one piece. And then as he continued his story, he told me how he reported the injury to his supervisor, and he brought a business card of his supervisor and he showed it to me and he said, I reported it to this person, and it was the person's name on the business card. And he said that this person on this business card then called Human Resources and reported it to this person, and he had another business card and he showed me those names. And I thought, well, these are details that are verifiable, they're potentially verifiable. In other words, a person could contact this supervisor, a person could contact this person in HR and either follow up on this testimony. And he stated that he then went to the address of the Med 7 that was listed or that was written on the piece of baseboard from the job site. And he said when he was at Med 7, he spoke to the manager at Med 7 and he had a business card of the manager from Med 7, and he explained to me what happened in their interaction, and he brought forth these details with corroborating supportive documentation behind the details. And as he went on and on and on with his testimony, I realized that he was providing many details, so his story was believable. It was rich in detail, so it was believable. And of the details that he was providing to me, many of them were potentially verifiable. And that's all we're looking for in our interactions with examinees, is to assess their credibility. We assess the potential verifiability of the details that they provide us in their story. It's the very best that we can do as qualified medical evaluators. And this particular examinee impressed me with the potential verifiability of the details that he offered, and so I was able to provide an opinion for industrial injury in his case. So there you have it, doctors. This is the tools to help you arrive at your AOE-COE determination, which need not be difficult for you at all. So I hope this helps you, and in our next session, we're going to go into the difficult determination of arriving at the proper and accurate permanent impairment rating for your examinee. So for today, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I want to thank you for taking the time to join me on this QME continuing education video. And for now, I'm wishing you best success in your career as a qualified medical evaluator.